Okay, welcome and a very good evening to everyone. Thank you for your interest and for attending this event today. We are very pleased to open up the 2021 season after the COVID lockdown and summer. As everyone else, VKC perforce has moved to a virtual mode of operation, and instantly we can see the positives to that. Now we can reach or be reached by, for that matter, a substantially larger audience. In fact, as I'm scanning through the audience tag names, I can see people from far and wide across Canada and overseas as well. To ensure our smooth passage tonight, some important household rules to follow, please. Keep yourselves muted and your cameras turned off to save bandwidth for better transmission, and most importantly, to preserve our nerves, our speakers, yours and mine. So we will ensure that people in the audience are muted, so don't take personal offense. Hosting this webinar online is a new experience to us. Therefore, should there be any interruption or commotion, please have patience and understanding while we are resolving the issue. So, my name is Sofia Niyazova. I am the designated host for the VKC events this semester. There are new people joining our gang, therefore a brief introduction of who we are is necessary. Vancouver Kimberlite cluster has been in existence since 2012 and is organized by the University of British Columbia. It is a series of seminars dedicated to diamond geology and related topics. The aim is to bring industry professionals and academics together to share ideas. SRK Consulting has been our loyal sponsor since 2014 and continuing to be so. We appreciate their support very much. So yay goes for SRK. This is my line. This is my line invention. Now, the presentation will take about 1 hour, followed by Q&A session. So keep your questions till then. I will explain the rules for Q&A once we get there. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, David Sacco. He is a senior surficial exploration specialist at Palmer. David is a 100% Canadian geologist, born, bred, and living in Canada. He earned his master's degree from Simon Fraser University in 2008. His project was studying the quaternary geology of a section of central BC for application to mineral exploration. Prior to joining Palmer in 2016, David worked directly for a few private exploration companies and then as a consultant. He spent some time with the government at the BC Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources, supporting geoscience projects. And he's also been involved in research projects as a member of a graduate student committee through Geoscience BC. Diamonds are his passion, yet he has applied his trade to everything from water and aggregates to gold and uranium. With Palmer, David is building a resource exploration sector focused on applying quaternary science to exploration, which is a unique exploration service provided by their consultancy firm, at least in Canada. Remote interpretations of the landscape is David's forte. Mixing diamonds and quaternary geology together leads to David's talk today, which reads, Drift prospecting for Kimberlite in the Slave Geological Province, why your Kim-bearing sediment samples may not be leading you to Kimberlite. I'm sure especially explorationists out there in the audience will be listening with redoubled attention. David, are you copying?
I am.
Great, so the curtain is up and the virtual stage is all yours. Please proceed.
Thank you very much for the introduction.
So let's share the screen.
Yep.
Yeah. Is that my move or your move?
You share your screen.
All right, are we good?
Mm-hmm.
All good.
Okay, so thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to this. It's an interesting opportunity that I unfortunately did get postponed, but we're back at it now. I understand there's been maybe limited input from the surficial geology side of things at these meetings. So hopefully this will be entertaining for everyone and, you know, maybe you'll learn a thing or two. And without further ado, I guess we will discuss drift prospecting in the Slave Geological Province. So a little bit about Palmer and where sort of we come into this exploration picture. We have an exploration group, as Sophie mentioned, that really our focus is applying quaternary science to mineral exploration. We've collaborated with government, industry, academia, and one of the main aspects of this is really to bridge the gap between exploration and academia. There is research going on in academia that's not being transferred as well as we necessarily like it to. So by staying involved in sort of all of these facets, we're able to focus some of the research, the graduate projects that are going on, and also be involved in this so we can, just be a little more aware of where these new advancements are and figure out how we can apply them. And by being involved with industry, we actually have projects that we can apply these tactics to. We've got a team of about 6 people that are generally focused on exploration. And in the Slave over the last few years, we've done quite a bit of work with the NTGS and also private industry. And we've mapped and been involved in data evaluations in about project areas for about 15,000 square kilometers. So we've seen a lot of ground, we've seen a lot of different scenarios, and through that have gained a lot of interesting experiences that we bring back and we try to just put back into the industry to get this moving. So a very brief overview of what we're going to talk about, or what I'm going to talk about today. A little bit of the trend of diamond exploration in Canada. We'll talk a little bit about what I call the broken loop of surficial exploration, how we've been doing things and how maybe we should be doing it different, and how we can get a fresh perspective into this and breathe a little bit of new life into the idea, into the concept of the surficial aspect of exploration for diamonds. We'll talk about some of the surficial processes that affect diamond exploration and really how we can apply this knowledge back to finding new kimberlite. This talk is it's a compilation of several talks. Some of these slides, if anybody's seen me talk about this before, are going to be familiar. And it's been a good opportunity to really put a lot of these 15, 20-minute talks together into something a little bit more comprehensive. So we'll start off looking at a brief recap of exploration in the Slave Province. So as we know, it's fairly young. It's really only been 30 years that this has been going on heavily in the Slave Geological Province in Canada for diamonds. It really started with a rush in the early 90s, and I'm going to show you a few time slices just looking at the discoveries and the resulting sort of claims that the resulting claim staking that occurred around those discoveries. So 92 to 95, this is really the boom. This is really when, it was the Wild West out there, claim staking, dropping claim posts from helicopters, all sorts of interesting stories about how exploration started for diamonds up there. And just an incredible amount of data was collected at that time. During those first 5 years, 325 kimberlite occurrences were identified, and there was just extensive ground staking that occurred. This is early, lots of data collected, but the quality of this data in some aspects was questionable. So 98 to 2003, less kimberlites, but 100 kimberlites, and we can start to see a concentration of claim staking. So we're starting to see the claims really focus in that large data set, has pointed us towards some general areas, pointed industry towards some general areas where these claims are really focused. Looking at 2004 to 2009, fewer kimberlites again, so less than 40 occurrences were identified, and a real reduction in claim staking around that period. And then into the last decade, we stopped the research at 2018 here. We don't even want to include 2020 in that. So in the last decade, relatively few kimberlite occurrences have been found. And definitely the claim staking is really focused largely around areas where there are already known kimberlites. So brownfield programs looking to sort of, are there any more in this general cluster? And this is kind of an important aspect because there are other areas out there that have potential for this. But we've really, the focus is really, centered into this lac de Gras area. So over that 30 years or so, just a huge amount of data has been collected. Hundreds of thousands of surface sediment samples, many, many square kilometers of geophysics. Can't even count how many meters of drill core have been drilled looking for kimberlite. And, a little under 500 kimberlite occurrences have been found, and again, largely constrained to the lac de Gras region. So another metric we can look at this is the dollars and cents. Looking at these graphs on the right, we've got annual expenditure on the top, diamond projects in the middle, kimberlite discoveries on the bottom. And we can all see the trend that's going on here. There's probably a cyclical effect. The more investment, the more projects there's going to be, and probably the more discoveries there's going to be. But we can certainly see a reduction in work that's going on up here. And what we can absolutely say is if we're not finding kimberlite, if we're not finding diamonds, then investment interest is going to decline. And that's unfortunate for the economy. It's unfortunate for a lot of things. It's unfortunate for us who enjoy this science, who enjoy looking for diamonds, who enjoy this. So it's important that if we're going to keep going, if we're going to keep the Vancouver kimberlite cluster alive, if we're going to keep a lot of industry going, we might need to take a new look at how we approach this. So this is a very, very generalized look at how exploration works. A lot of it is going to start with drift prospecting. Going to go out and collect some surface samples. We're going to identify a kim dispersal, and that's going to lead us to some general target areas that we're going to go do some geophysics on, refine those targets further, and then we're going to put some drills in the ground and hopefully find that kimberlite that we're all looking for. As we move up this chain, it gets considerably more expensive. A surface sample compared to a drill hole, considerably difference in that. And really the point here is from again, the surficial perspective, a lot of this work is founded on this surficial data. It really leads us to these areas where we're starting to spend these bigger dollars on these larger exploration programs. So it makes sense that we have a good understanding of the foundation, the data that's really part of the foundation of this whole exploration process. So we've all seen a figure like this. I'm not gonna beat this to death by any means. There's really two simple components to drift prospecting. You find sediments that are anomalous, and you figure out where they came from. In general, the anomalous sediments, so we're looking at surface sediments, we're collecting samples, we're sending them off to Christiana, and we're figuring out what's in those samples, and we're getting some results back, we find our anomalies, and then we go look at the landscape and figure out where those came from. Typically, we like to use subglacial till. There's a lot of different materials we can use, or there's several different materials we can use, but subglacial till tends to be the preference, and this is because of the genesis. It's eroded, it's transported, and it's deposited under the ice, which means its composition is very similar to the local bedrock. It's a first derivative of that bedrock, so compositionally, without actually taking the bedrock, it's our closest understanding of what's there. The transport history is relatively easy. If we can piece together the ice flow history, we can figure out where these materials came from. And it ends up, it's a large anomaly. So the process of this erosion deposition essentially smears that kimberlite across the landscape. So we've got a fairly large anomaly that we can find through different ranges of sampling or densities of sampling and hone in on where it came from. Now, where this tends to fall apart is it has to be in situ subglacial till to make this, textbook model that I'm showing here. If it's not, then it's going to be difficult to identify that anomaly because you're going to have different anomaly thresholds for different materials. The transport histories are going to be different. And really, when we look at our historic data sets, we absolutely 100% cannot assume that these are in situ tills. So when we look at our historic data sets or data sets that come along with the properties that we're looking on, there's no way we're ever going to see this textbook dispersal. So we've got to do something to understand that a little bit more. So into the broken loop of exploration, we've got a large data set, hundreds of thousands of samples that was collected throughout, a few decades of work. And within this data set, we've got different material types, we've got different sample sizes. Some were concentrated in the field, some weren't. Some were processed at a lab, some were processed in somebody's garage. On top of that, we've got locational errors for where these samples came from, GPS issues in the 90s. Some were just marked on maps and things like that. So we've got to understand that the data set that we're largely dealing with historically is not necessarily what we think it is. On the right here, I've just shown a picture. This is just a clip of the KID data set. And we've got chromium plotted here. And what we can see is really nothing to do with geology. What we see in this is the different surveys. You can see all those nice little perfectly gridded blue dots in there. I'm not sure, I think you can see my arrow. Yep. You can see those nicely gridded blue dots in there. It is highly unlikely that those samples were collected on such a strategic grid or such an accurate grid. And also, they're all duds. They don't have anything in them. So what was different about that program to the one on the top that produced these much higher anomalies? So you can see in this data set, it's just a demonstration that when we mix all this variability, we lose the signal of bedrock. And this is incredibly common. So that was our first part of drift prospecting, is the data set we're using to identify the anomalies. And the second part is the framework that we're using to figure out where these anomalies came from. So a lot of the slave has been mapped at a regional scale by the GSC. These are good geologists. These are good surficial geologists. These are people who know what they're talking about. But the protocols of that mapping, the scale of that mapping, really doesn't allow us to zoom in on on the specific processes that are going to affect the distribution of indicator minerals or pathfinder elements. It doesn't have the detail for us to compare previous samples, historic samples to this, and understand the genesis of them, because as we know, or as we can imagine, in the early 90s, when we hired a bunch of second-year students to go out and put till in the bag, I suspect that they didn't know what till was, and a lot of the people running those projects also didn't. So we've got quite a plethora of materials in there, and we need something to be able to go back to and say, what do we think these materials were? And this regional framework, unfortunately, is it's valuable in what it is, but it just lacks that resolution that we need to discriminate material types and geomorphic processes that are going to affect the mobility of these materials. So what this comes down to, same input, same output. You get a historic data set, you put it through the ring of that surficial framework, you identify some sort of anomaly that is there, you go try and follow it up, maybe you add a few more samples to it, but maybe even just adding more variability to the data set. You don't find anything, the property changes hands, the next guy gets it, the next company gets it, the next person gets it, and they go through the same thing again. We've actually seen the same data set come to us twice. And just like you shake your head like, oh no, like we've got to do better than this. So targets aren't panning out. We're not finding what we want to. And in the infamous words of Dave White, we've got to stop walking down the same hallway. We're walking into that building, we're turning left at the first door, we're coming to the same crappy results, and then we flip the property over, somebody picks it up and does it again. Somebody amalgamates some properties, does it again. So we need a way to define lower risk exploration targets. We've got a lot of data. These are all the, this is the KID data set again. So these are all sample points, surface sediment sample points. That is a lot of data. What are we going to do to do something better with that data and keep the investors interested so that we can keep doing, you know, what we're passionate about here. So on to the fresh perspective. We're definitely building on the previous concepts. We are standing on the shoulders of giants. There's no debating that. We're not doing anything new. These are the same techniques. The mapping that I showed earlier, and I'll show again later, was actually my master's supervisor who did that original mapping, and I had the benefit or the experience to map the same area in higher resolution, which was a fun, you know, couple of phone calls, like, what were you doing, you know? But it's not his fault. It really is. It's the scale and the resolution of mapping. But now we can get 20 centimeter stereo imagery from space. These used to be areas that we had to spend a lot of money to get out to, and we could get some point locations by landing our helicopter and digging a hole. But now we have high resolution elevation data. We've got free elevation data at 2-meter resolution. We've got LiDAR that is just incredible at showing the intricacies of the surficial environment. So we've got a lot more, we've got higher resolution data. We can understand the situation with better. We've also got the technology. We've got digital mapping software that we can see 3D in our computers. We can put on our little glasses and, you know, we can see 3D in our monitors, and we can draw out these features and really understand the landscape at a level that wasn't available before. So going to move on a little bit and talk about the actual geology that's out there. So some of these surficial processes that are affecting our dispersal patterns, that are affecting our ability to interpret the material, and have altered some of those primary dispersal patterns that we're really looking at. There are a variety of scales of these processes. And for this specific area, I'm going to concentrate on meltwater because it really is probably the biggest impact. You can imagine a 2-kilometer ice sheet melting. There is a lot of water associated with that. And it's really not recognized, the effects of that water, in a lot of the regional mapping because, again, the scale just doesn't allow for that. So melting a continental ice sheet, there's a lot of water going through. It has potential to affect concentrations and remobilize sediments. We really need to recognize this in order to derive those better targets. So we're going to look at subglacial meltwater corridors and glacial lakes, as these are things that we've consistently identified in the mapping in the Slave region, and these are things that generally weren't identified at a large scale previously. So subglacial meltwater corridor, essentially this is just meltwater that's moving under the ice. These are very dynamic time transgressive systems. So they're largely controlled by the morphology of the ice sheet, the amount of meltwater that's around, the position of the ice margin in relation to the area you are. It's going to be different if you're near the ice margin versus if you're farther away from the ice margin. And these things change drastically over time. Sometimes they turn on, sometimes they turn off, sometimes they're erosive, sometimes they're depositional. Sometimes the ice recouples and then just plows it all over again, and you kind of start fresh. So you can see in the image on the right here that this area, you can see the scale, it's about 4 kilometers, that scale on the bottom, and you can see that there's these like 1 to 2 kilometer corridors just ripping across that landscape. The KID data set was collected without reference to this. So you've got samples that are in those corridors, out of those corridors. We're looking at all these together. So we're going to zoom in on a portion of that right now. On the left, you can see an ortho photo of the landscape of part of this meltwater corridor. And on the right, I've just drawn some rough polygons in there so you can see sort of the different landscapes. So right away, we can see some of the positive relief features. We can see the esker systems in the LiDAR on the right here. You can see these mounds, these glacial fluvial hummocks and mounds. This region here, this scoured region, You can really see the texture of the bedrock in that scarred region, the esker running through there. And then down these beige areas, these are areas where the ice actually recoupled and started to streamline these rounded glacial fluvial deposits. So it's not an easy, in the imagery, these look like drumlins. So you couldn't really fault someone for calling that a drumlin and telling someone to go sample that. It's not until you have this bigger picture context where you can start peeling these landscapes apart. So what are the effect of these different zones on our indicator mineral concentrations, or on the dispersal of those indicator minerals? So the scour zones, typically you're looking at exposed bedrock. So this is areas of really high pressure. The water is blowing through there at a high velocity. It's removing a lot of the sediment. You're commonly going to get these boulder legs. If you guys have been out to the Slave, you've probably seen these bedrock fields with these round boulders sitting on top of them. Some of those are actually just a lag deposit from large meltwater events. So you get boulder legs, you get reworked till, and usually they're going to be adjacent to those other features I was talking about. There's this constant landform assemblage where you get a scour zone followed by deposition. So you get erosion here, deposition here, erosion here, deposition here. So this is a repeated thing we see across the landscape. So how do these scour zones, the kims in these scour zones, in some areas they're just completely removed. If you've removed all the sediment, you've removed all the kims. In other areas, you may concentrate these kims. So you've got meltwater going through there, so there may be a concentration of indicator minerals in that area, similar as you would find in a placer deposit. So you might concentrate the heavier gold or the heavier diamonds through those fluvial processes. You're going to get the same effect on the heavy minerals of the kims, which are the kims. And then something that is definitely important to consider is remobilization from that primary dispersal. So we're always looking for that primary dispersal because it's the easiest way to figure out where they came from. But these zones are going to clearly affect the shape of that dispersal. So onto the depositional side of things. So we're talking about these hummocky glacial fluvial, these esker deposits. Here's a photo of them here. They're typically fairly easy to identify. Anybody flying over is going to be able to see these. They're positive relief features. They're well drained, so they have different vegetative indicators. A lot of the time, there's an armored surface. As the wind blows over these features, it winnows out the fine, and you get kind of an armored gravel surface. And typically, you'll see ice wedge polygons. These things are usually full of ice as well. So the effect on kims, again, we've remobilized from that primary dispersal. In some cases, if there's a kimberlite right there, we all know the story, you could have primary dispersal from an esker, but it's probably pretty rare. Most of the time, the eskers are composed of reworked till or other materials that are already there. Indicator mineral counts, well, it could go either way. It could concentrate them because it's a fluvial process, or depending on the facies of the esker that you're in, it could deplete them. You may just, all of those heavies may have fallen out earlier, and you may be in an area where it is literally barren of kims. So there's a lot of variability when looking at the glacial fluvial deposits. So here's another, just graphically showing the difference of kim concentrations related to the subglacial meltwater processes. So got some box plots on the top, some probability plots on the bottom. And where this data came from is, again, we took the KID data set. So we tried to work with as much public data as we could with this. So we took the KID data set and we compared it to one of our high resolution mapping projects to get a better understanding of the genesis of those samples. So we broke it out into looking at till samples, glacial fluvial samples, and reworked till samples. And what we found across the board, and you can really see it in the probability plots, is that the anomalies associated with the reworked till samples were higher than everything else. The anomalies associated with the glacial fluvial samples were higher than the till samples. And the till samples, which are really the ones that we're interested, because again, that primary dispersal that's easiest to follow up on, were the lowest of the anomalies. So on all three situations, we had the lowest anomalies, except for a few outliers, in the till sample. Now, what that means is if we put all this data together, we will not see that primary dispersal at all. It'll be completely buried in the higher concentration samples, or the higher, the samples with higher concentrations of the glacial fluvial rework till. Now, it's easy to pull out the glacial fluvial samples. It's an esker. You can generally identify where those are, but the rework till, it can be a little bit more difficult to identify. So this can really complicate identifying where the dispersal is, what the primary part of it is, and where the source might actually be. So the other meltwater process I want to talk about was glacial lakes. There are probably some people on the call that are laughing right now because I may have a reputation of seeing glacial lakes all over the place. And it's because they were there. There's all sorts of evidence for these things. We see glacial accustomed plains. We see eskers that have been washed. We see eskers that have been armored, boulder armored eskers that were due to wave washing. Shorelines all over the place. Like I said, we've mapped a lot of the Slave right now, and there's a lot of evidence of glacial lakes that, because of the periglacial processes, the cryoturbation associated with the tundra, and the homogenization of the landscape, a lot of these features are generally just blended together. So it's not like you don't see these sharp shorelines all over the place. You really only see them in certain areas. And unless you've taken a larger look at the landscape and found these bits of evidence to start piecing together, it is difficult to see them. So similar to the meltwater corridors, they're time transgressive. They tend to follow the ice margin back. So as the ice margin is moving, there's many times there will be a glacial lake that's moving back with the ice margin. Isostasy is another factor that we don't have a lot of control over, or really any control over, but it's also another factor that can create a situation for a glacial lake basin to form that in the present day after rebound, there's no more evidence of it. So where do we get the clues from this? Like I kind of alluded to, I'm not crazy. We see paleo shorelines, we see delta top sets. A lot of the esker complexes, you'll regularly see these beads, and in many cases, those beads represent deltas where the meltwater is essentially exiting the glacier into a glacial lake. So shorelines, top set spillways, and again, just the limit of glacial accustomed sedimentation. In the tundra, this generally just looks like organic deposits. And if you're looking kind of in a postage stamp, you're going to map that as organics. But if you're looking at it in a bigger picture and can put together, okay, well, here's a shoreline here, and these all have the same elevations as this delta does here, well, now we can start to say, okay, well, that's a lot of information that suggests that there was a glacial lake that formed here. And then we can look at those organic deposits and say, well, isn't that conspicuous that those organics are developing there, but this similar situation at higher elevation, they're not? We can go out in the field, we can dig in it, and we can find those deposits, or we hit ice and we don't find anything because it's very frozen up there. But these are the implications of glacial lakes. If we don't recognize them, we can't apply those implications back to our data set. So through the mapping that's been done, through the research that we've been trying to kind of push, I've identified basically three different glacial lake environments that you can see in the landscape. We've got the offshore environment, so that's outlined in dark purple. We've got a nearshore environment. This is just a little snippet from an air photo that showed this fairly clearly. As with most geology, it's not cut and dry. This is all a spectrum. So, we draw the lines the best we can. So again, offshore, we've got the near shore, and then we've got the shoreline, and then we've got a little bit of till over here. I think I'm pointing at it. There are a bunch of faces on that side of my screen, but I hope there's till over there. So the offshore environment, typically what you're finding here, this is basin deposits. This is silt and sand. It's fairly well sorted. You may get some large boils forming in these sorted sediments, and it's very common to have organic deposits. So you can see some of these very bland vegetation patterns in here. That's just organics developing over top of these poorly drained silts and sands here. So the effect in relation to chems, This is material that is settled out of suspension in a lake. So you can imagine when the sediment enters the lake, the heavy stuff is going to fall out first. That's our indicator minerals. The light stuff kind of carries on and then settles out into that lake basin. So typically, these are going to be barren of indicator minerals. Important thing to know. So moving into the nearshore environment, typically what we see in this nearshore environment is a mantle of glacial lacustrine material, normally thin and discontinuous over top of till. And what we'll find is that you look at the frost boils in there, and one frost boil will be till, and then you go to the next one, and it's some weird sandy, silty thing. And then you go to the next one, and it's till again. And you go to the next one, and it's something in between those things. So it's a dynamic environment, and if you send somebody to sample frost boils there, they're going to find a frost boil, and they're going to send it. You know, they're going to put it in the bag. But what's difficult to understand is whether or not that is actually the material we're looking for. That's actually the in situ till. In the picture on the left here, this is the pit that I dug, and this is the pit that my colleague dug. We're about 4 meters apart, 4 or 5 meters apart here. And this is the material that came out of it. So mine was an oxidized, very well sorted sand, and hers was a silty diamond. So these are basically right beside each other, and it's just a function of the cryoturbation. And sometimes the till boils through the material. Sometimes the cryoturbation is going to incorporate that glacial lacustrine material into the till, resulting in a dilution of whatever indicator minerals might have been in there. So we'll move on to the shoreline environments here. And this is the wave action zone. So this is where we've got waves washing the shoreline. This is going to be typical to the shore, or this is going to be the same as the shorelines that you see currently now in the landscape. They're commonly boulder laden, and there's sand in between them. So usually it's boulders, it's sand, and then there's some organics growing over top of them. Similar to the fluvial situation, we do have the potential to concentrate kims here. There are definitely stories of the shorelines that are a specific color based on a specific heavy mineral that is concentrated on that shoreline. It is a good place to go and get a general sense of, you know, kind of a pre-concentrated sample, but you have to know how you're evaluating that, because if you evaluate that sample with the adjacent till samples, there's going to be quite a contrast there. And if you look at that in the context that it's all till, you're going to be going to the wrong place to find the source of that. So in the shoreline environment, typically we can have two scenarios. You can have a concentration of kims, or it's possible to have a dilution of kims as well. I think the main idea is here is that there's a lot of unknowns in that, so you really don't want to be sampling that if you can help it. So I do like numbers. I like things to have some numerical quantification associated with them. So we did a little bit of testing and looked at, on the left here, we're looking at granulometry, and we're using the granulometry as a measure of dilution of materials. So I probably should have put a picture of each of the sites on here, but there were 2 frost boils on this graph here. These are about 1 meter. There's quite a bit of vertical exaggeration there. There were 2 frost boils, one on this peak, which was above what we interpreted to be the glacial lacustrine inundation, and one down in this basin, which was below what it was. So if you look at the resulting graphs here, this is probably the easiest one to look at, O2, which is the one up top. You can see there's a fairly even distribution of silt and the different sand fractions in there, with a lack of the very coarse stuff and the very fine stuff. When we look at the sample that was in the basin, there is a striking increase of silt in that sample. So even though these frost boils looked similar, they did have similar morphology. The ones in the basin tend to be a bit bigger. Sometimes there's some grass growing on them. There are some subtle cues, but again, if you send someone out there looking for frost boils, they're going to find that and they're going to sample it. And there is a pretty significant difference into that. So if we look at the Kim concentrations, I switched up the colors on you here, but the blue is the till, the red is the shoreline deposit, which I haven't shown on here, and the green is, is there a way I can move that? There we go. And the green is the basin deposit. And again, looking at the probability plots and the resulting Kims. So this is, again, KID data that was overlain on high resolution mapping to get an idea of what material was sampled. So the till plots right in the middle, the shoreline predictably, the anomalies are higher on the shoreline, and the basin, there's some dilution in there. So again, we're seeing some pretty significant effects to these processes that in the overall landscape due to the cryoturbation, homogenization, are fairly subtle. So here's, I guess, just talking a little bit more about the subtleness of these features. All of these pits are similar diamics that we found in a fairly small area. You can see on the image here, everything looks fairly similar in this image, but there's quite a bit of diversity in there. Only one of these pictures is actually a till sample. The other are sandy diamics that without that for most people would be assumed till, and I think that makes a lot of sense because you're looking for diamics and you find it, but the yeah, it can be difficult to recognize these things is the main point. So being able to step back and having some sort of framework to say, I'm in an area that was inundated by a glacial lake, I should look out for this, or I'm in an area that was affected by meltwater, I should look out for these differences in the sediments that I'm sampling, provides a level of information that will greatly improve the reliability of the resulting data. So let's talk about how these meltwater processes actually affect the Kim dispersals. So we've got a hypothetical situation here. We've all seen these proportional dot plots. The big circles represent more, little circles represent less. So with our understanding of drift prospecting, we see our anomaly, we look at our ice flow, and we are going to go look up ice for that source. And in this particular situation, obviously, for demonstrative purposes, we would be wrong. So looking at the evolution of that pattern a bit more, initially, so the blue represents ice. So we've got a kimberlite, it's got the biggest diamond we've ever seen. We want to find that thing. There's a primary dispersal in the till that follows the ice flow direction. If that was the case, we'd probably be able to find this diamond. But we bring in our subglacial meltwater corridor, it strips one area and then deposits material over here off to the side, which is concentrated due to those meltwater processes, which now becomes the more highly anomalous area. To add insult to injury, ice retreats, a glacial lake forms and dumps a bunch of glacial lacustrine sediment over top of the remaining primary dispersal. So we've really modified that dispersal quite heavily, but if we know what has occurred in there, we can use that on that dispersal level. We can use that information to better understand where this material actually came from. We can understand that, oh, there's no Kims here because it was eroded. There's a concentration of Kims here because there was meltwater concentrating those Kims. And there was dilution in these areas because that lake was dumping a bunch of barren sediment over top of the till that then mixed in, created these nice frost boils. It seemed like a great sample media, but in reality have probably misled our efforts a little bit. So the question becomes, how do we apply this knowledge to exploration? Again, bridging that gap between I can show you these graphs and I can show you these maps, but how can we actually implement that into our exploration strategies? So the first and probably most important thing is we have a better understanding of the surficial framework, or we can gain a better understanding of the surficial framework now. Again, here's just a comparison of the mapping. The original 1 to 125 scale mapping that was done by my supervisor, by the GSC. A lot of respect for that guy. I had a lot of fun, again, calling him up and asking what he was thinking. We had way better data to work with. We had LiDAR, we had high resolution imagery, and we were able to pull out a lot more of these intricate processes that were going to affect things. And as a result, we can essentially identify areas. We can turn this into a stoplight and say, where it's green, you go nuts. That data is good. That's primary dispersal. Where it's orange, where it's getting into the red, you want to be a little bit more careful. You're going to have to plan your surveys more carefully there. You're going to have to consider, you know, who's sampling that and do they know what they're looking for? Have you trained your staff appropriately? So with a better understanding of the surficial environment, we can look backwards at the existing data and say, what was this material? We can get rid of some samples that may be misleading. We can better understand secondary remobilization and why there may be concentrations, sporadic concentrations that don't really line up with other things, other lines of evidence. And we can also look forward and say, okay, in these green areas, we just go sample and it's going to be great data. In the lighter green areas, in the orange and the red areas, we need to be careful in there. And if we do collect a sample, we want to make sure we know what that material is and how that's going to compare it to, you know, the other samples that we have, the rest of our existing data set. So we need to use this surficial framework to conduct a critical evaluation of the data. The easy stuff, as we've all heard this saying, the low-hanging fruit's gone, easy stuff is found. We need to be a little bit more critical about the data that we're using in our exploration efforts. So as most of you know, it's really the contrast of data that leads us to our mineral deposits. The contrast related to geology is what we're looking for. But unfortunately, what we commonly see in these data sets is contrast related to sampling protocols. Some were sieved in the field and 10 kilograms was sent to the lab. Some were not sieved in the field and 10 kilograms were sent to the lab. Some we don't know how much was sent to the lab. Some were till, some were not till. Some were analyzed for, you know, 0.25 to 5 grain size. Some were 0.5 to 1. If we don't understand, if we don't know all of these subtle differences, what we're going to see in our data set is not going to be related to geology. It's going to be related to all of the internal variability within that data set. I'm not going to get into the analytical procedures. We're going to stick to the surficial side of things right now. But suffice it to say that the same techniques that we would use to differentiate different materials, we would do the same inventory on a historic data set, trying to understand what analytical and sampling procedures were used and how that might affect the comparability of the resulting data. So what we've got here on the right, we've got, again, the KID data set. Overlain on the black polygons represent the regional surficial mapping. Based on that, it would appear that we have mostly till samples. The dark green are till samples, the yellow are modern. So it was mapped as organics or stream, alluvial, or some sort of beach sediment, something like that. So in that framework, it looks like a really good data set. But when we look at the high resolution data, when we've got these new advancements in technology, we're zooming in on our computers, we're looking literally from space at boulders and identifying the lithology of them, you start to see a little bit more of a Christmas tree going on. We can see we've got a lot fewer of those dark green samples, a lot of lake affected samples, a lot of reworked till samples. There's glacial fluvial samples in there, there's glacial lacustrine samples in there. And this data set, the result, you know, when we plot up these results, we're going to be seeing patterns in the surficial geology. We're not going to be seeing patterns related to indicator mineral dispersal. So by looking at this in the higher resolution, in this higher resolution framework, we can really understand the true coverage of our data. Does this data set actually assess the potential of this area I've shown here? Well, when we filter out all the samples that are not helpful, it really probably doesn't. We probably need to go collect a few more samples out there. And, you know, there is resistance to throw away this data. It was collected over a long time. It was expensive to collect this data. It's a historic data set that appears to be very full and useful, but it can be incredibly misleading. So we have to be willing to part with some of that data and consider the relative cost of going out and collecting 50 more samples compared to putting a drill in the wrong spot. So think there was something else I meant to say on this slide, and maybe someone will bring it up in a question. So moving forward, and looking at actually identifying anomalies within the data set. So now we've kind of filtered our data set down to materials that we feel are useful. We've got till, primary dispersal. We've got reworked till, which if we understand these meltwater corridors, we understand their secondary dispersal. So they're still useful. We just have to look at them slightly differently. The important aspect is what is the anomaly threshold for those materials? So again, if we put the reworked till and the till, use the same anomaly thresholds, we're not going to see that primary dispersal. But if we use different anomaly thresholds, we'll essentially level that data together, and then we can look at the morphology or the geomorphological processes and start to tease apart that dispersal pattern. And again, glacial fluvial, it's very predictable where this material came from and where it's going. There's some debate about how far it's traveled, but as something that is going to focus us in on areas for further studies, it's very useful, but we have to separate it from the till data. So on the left, looking at just the different kin concentrations and how we have to define different anomaly thresholds. And on the right, we're looking at the blue arrows represent ice flow, so that's going to be our primary transport. And then also these meltwater corridors that are ripping through the area, modifying that transport and potentially concentrating or removing kims from the area. So it gives us an understanding of what's anomalous, and it gives us an understanding of how that material has moved through the landscape. So when we get down to actually plotting this data up, we can see much more sensible patterns going on here. We have a predicted transport method, so we can look specifically at our reworked till samples, our glacial fluvial samples, and see on the bottom here is a really good example. The triangles are glacial fluvial samples about how the till dispersal is basically to the west here, but the glacial fluvial dispersal actually pulls it down to the southwest. Now, if we didn't know that, we might target different areas. This is just an example, but you can see how those different directions could lead us to a different target where we're going to actually look for that sample. Ultimately, this allows for better recognition of what are true anomalies. So not just something that's been concentrated in a glacial lake shoreline or concentrated through glacial fluvial processes, but actual true anomalies that are related to bedrock, that are related to mineralization or changes in bedrock. We typically get a sharper delineation to the dispersal, so removing sort of that blurry area where you've got that little bit of reworking that could be maybe concentrating things on areas of the dispersal where you wouldn't expect it to be concentrated. And in general, all of this is combining together to lead us back to lower risk exploration targets. So we're not being misled by our data. We're not going to areas and following up and not finding what we expect to find. And it's a better use of our exploration dollars. So just to kind of summarize what we've gone through here and sort of how exploration looks through a surficial perspective, I guess is a good way to put it. We are definitely in the early stages of diamond exploration in Canada. 30 years, like this isn't a lot of time. There's been a lot of advancements in geophysical methods or geophysics methods. There have been a lot of advancements, but really we're going down the same corridors, the same door. We're doing the same thing with the same surficial data over and over again. And it really is time to change that, because if we don't find better targets, this industry, it's going to have an effect on the industry, unfortunately. And again, all of us who are really interested in this stuff, from, it's a bit of a passion for most of us. I'm sure most people on this call, the paycheck is nice, but really, wouldn't you like to put your name on a diamond mine, right? So we need to change the trend, and we have the resources to do that now. At our fingertips, literally, we have the resources. From space, we've got high resolution imagery. We don't have to task a plane to go fly imagery. We've got good elevation models that are also derived from photogrammetry, from space, from satellites, from data collected from satellites. we can now provide a much more detailed framework to work within than we could before, and we don't have to go out to every one of these field sites to identify it. We need to understand that the existing surficial data is of limited use. There's really good data in there, and we need a mechanism to filter out that good data from the data that's misleading us. Again, being the foundation of some of these projects, having that surficial perspective is going to provide us a means to filter out, identify what the valuable data is, what the reliable data is, and move or remove the misleading data points from it. I think that I covered most of these things in fewer points than what I had, but as a relatively closing statement here, if we look at the images on the right, it really paints the picture quite clearly. The top image is unprocessed KID data, and the bottom image is processed KID data. And by processed, I mean looked at from a surficial perspective compared to surficial mapping, evaluated, and thresholds defined based on the different genetic subpopulations, and also consideration in this particular example to the analytical methods, whether it was what grain size was used, trying to normalize those samples. And it's a very stark difference. One of them we have one target, and the other one we have several targets that we can go after. I believe that is the end of my of the presentation part of it. So thank you all for listening very much, and I'll turn it back to Sophia.
Thank you, David. Thank you for this insightful talk. Indeed, very useful information, something to keep in mind when doing sediment sampling for KIMS. Now I'm asking to everyone to unmute yourselves and give a round of applause to our speaker.
Thank you.
That's possible to do? Yep. Great. Now we can proceed with questions and answers. In order to prevent background noise, the rules. The rules are, so if you have a question, raise your hand. I can see you. I'm just joking. I mean your digital hand. So if you click on participants button, a window will pop up with participants, and there you will find a blue hand icon. This is your digital hand. Click on it, and I will see that you have a question. If you would like to remain silent and invisible, type your question in the chat box at the bottom of the participants window, and I will read it out loud for you. Now the Q&A is officially open. Anybody would like to start? Yeah, there is a question from Maureen. Please, Maureen, unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you please, and you can ask the question.
Unmute, start video. Here we go.
Maureen, do you hear?
Hello. Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Maybe don't look like Maureen. She's changed a little bit in the last little while. I have a question about the Kimberlite mineral grain morphology. Any comments on how that's affected with this redistribution processes?
Yeah, definitely. So the grain morphology changes quite a bit. I mean, as we know, the further you get away from the source, the less of sort of those primary morphological features we're going to see, the rims that we want to see indicating that we're closer to it. The ice has a tendency to really grind those primary morphology features up. So in a primary dispersal, the morphology is, we're going to lose those rims, we're going to lose some of those morphological features as we move away from it. Once you get into the fluvial environment, it's incredibly rare to see them. I say that with the caveat that I obviously hadn't seen all of the data out there, but it is considerably less common, let's put it that way, to see it once you've hit that remobilization point, you're really starting to toss those things around and bang them against other grains. So you're going to lose a lot of those features.
Thank you. I guess that covers that question. Next question from Mike McMorran.
No,
Please
we don't
go
want
ahead.
this question.
Dave, I can hear you, so you can't make comments like that.
Oh crap! Sorry, man. I mean, it's great to hear from you, Mike.
Yeah.
Can we see your art on the wall again, please?
Oh yeah, let's fire it up. I think there we go.
Awesome.
Yeah. Now I know, Dave, a lot of your experiences come in the Slave. I was just curious if you've had any interest from anyone to come over across the border into Nunavut to look at perhaps some of the glacial features in that part of the Arctic, and what your experience has been there.
Yeah, so we may have had a company who wanted us to look at the geology of one of their properties related to basically till sampling for indicated minerals for diamonds, and it's a different game up there. In the Slave, we're typically dealing with warm-based ice, so we're having good erosion of the bedrock or significant erosion of the bedrock, and we're smearing that material across the landscape. So we're seeing nice defined dispersals for the most part, except where these processes are messing with it. I would say the biggest difference as we move north and we get into Nunavut is the polythermal ice base. So we've got cold-based ice where the ice is essentially frozen to the ground and there is no real remobilization of those sediments. And there's very little, the Kimberlite itself is not necessarily being eroded and trained and transported. So the methods, okay, Mike, I can see you're getting a head rub right now. It's throwing me off. So the methods have to change there. So where you've got the warm-based ice, and I believe in the property that we may be referring to, there are sections where there's warm-based ice and there's sections where there's cold-based ice. Where you've got the warm-based ice, you can use your standard till sampling techniques. You can dig in those sediments, and you can kind of look up ice for that material. Where you've got your cold-based ice, you've got to look a little bit differently. One thing to consider is most of the material is probably shorter transported, and the mechanism is going to be different. So in areas like this, stream sampling, something that is a more modern distribution of the material could be more valuable. So if you've got maybe a slightly elevated area, you've got some well-defined drainages in there, you can choose some selective locations to do some stream sampling where that groundwater, that runoff has essentially eroded the bedrock and transported that material the same way the ice would have in the warm-based situation.
Great, thanks, Dave. Just one more quick question. I was just curious who is the person in that hole in your last slide there? I think
that is Robin McKillop. That is not me.
Is it?
He took a running start and he was bound and determined to get under there and find out what was going on. So he took a running start and dove in.
Well, that's good. I thought maybe he was talking when he maybe should have been listening when you guys were in the field one time. Excellent.
The other picture I have on some of my presentations, Mike, is you and I crying over a broken shovel.
I've shed many tears over a broken shovel. So, yeah. No, thank you very much, Dave. Sophia, that was a great talk. Thanks, Dave. Oh,
Thank you.
and there's little Dave.
Thank you. There is another question from Buddy Doyle. Buddy, can you unmute yourself? Turn your video, if you please.
Hi there. I think I've got audio. I haven't got much of a pipeline, so I'll stick to audio. Otherwise, it'll freeze. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, great talk, Dave. Thank you. I agree with most of what you said. Yeah, the KID database, it is what it is. It's one of the most valuable databases on the planet as far as we have it. But assessment reports, as a person that writes them in that area, you know, you do $5 a hectare a year, and if you spend more than $5, you don't bother putting it in there. Well, it's not publish or perish. It's we want to hide things from our competitors.
Yeah.
So, you know, you got to look at the database from that point of view.
Yeah, that's something that I didn't mention is the selective deposition into that database, I guess we'll say.
You still got to know what you're playing with, and you covered that well. I would say it's not always the glacial fluvials concentrate. You know, I would say Ranch Lake, DO27, Anuri, it was the opposite. Like 4 Ks away, you had much higher concentrates in the thousands of indicator minerals, and then something glacial fluvial comes away and it goes down to 4s or 10s.
Yeah.
So it doesn't always concentrate.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It depends on the facies, and also depends on like not all, like in certain situations, the glacial fluvial material will actually be bringing something in from a different area. So you might have a dispersal and your glacial fluvial is actually coming from over here, whereas your kimberlite might be down here creating a dispersal, and when you overprint that glacial fluvial, so you've got to, you know, considering the source areas of both of those things could have an impact. And I think what you're getting at is a good, what you've demonstrated is a really good point, that there is no cut and dry. It's almost dispersal specific.
And I was hoping you would show the South Copper Mine train so we could have an argument, but you didn't.
No, I would love to sit down with you and discuss that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Great talk.
That is for next time.
Yeah.
We have a question from Tom Nowitzki. Please go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me and see me okay?
Yeah, audible and visible.
Great, thanks. Dave, thanks for a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and very, very interesting and yeah, enjoyable, informative. And thanks Sophia and Maya for organizing and so on. It's been great. My question relates to the quality of data that you need to do the kind of analysis that you've been demonstrating to us there. And you showed some, you know, great work, you know, analysis based on DTM imagery and satellite imagery. Is that, from what I could tell, a lot of that looked like very high resolution DTMs, probably from LiDAR data, you know, where you get that level of detail of resolution of the topography and so on. Firstly, is that the case? And secondly, you know, would the data that's sort of freely available, the satellite data, the 2-meter resolution, for example, DTMs, be sufficient to be able to do that kind of analysis?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it really all depends on the scale of where you're at on your project. So that 2-meter data is free and fantastic. I do have, in one of the slides, there was sort of a side-by-side of the previous sort of geobase, you know, 30 or so meter DEM versus the 2-meter Arctic DEM. And it is a striking difference, and absolutely pulling out those meltwater corridors, it's very valuable for that. You can get an incredible amount of information from that freely available data. Even the imagery that comes with ARC, the imagery that's available on Google Earth, a lot of this imagery is better than what we can order in air photos, historic air photos that have been flown over the area. So there is 100% free data that will generally improve most areas, the understanding of most areas. Now, there is a scale that you hit depending on the size of your Depending on the size of the dispersal you're after, the size, like, where are we looking for large scale anomalies to focus geophysics, or are we actually looking for a drill target? We're not going to see some of those subtle features like the glacial lake shorelines are going to be much more difficult to see in the 2 meter DEM versus, 10 or 20 centimeter LiDAR or something like that. But I would say, the NTGS has been pushing a series of 1 to 50,000 scale interpretations that have been done with the Arctic DEM, and they are significantly more valuable than I shouldn't say more valuable, higher resolution interpretations, and we can see quite a bit more in that than what they could see from the original air photos in the 90s.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Tom. I do not see any more hands, and I can ask my question now. So my understanding is that you use large-scale landform features mostly. Do you utilize skim grain morphology in your analysis? Can you maybe unravel resedimentation processes, or a number of them, based on abrasion marks from the grains?
I would say on a confidence scale that the number of, like, if I can call them transportation vectors, I would not try to interpret the different transportation vectors or how much something has been remobilized based just on the grain morphology. I think there's a lot of information there, but it probably, like, we start to lose confidence and start to be a little bit more theoretical at a certain level. Like, we can only show so many things with evidence. So what we can show with evidence is that as we beat up those grains more, we're farther away from the source. When we're keeping some of those rims on those grains, then we're closer to the source. But I don't know if it would be much more than that. And to be honest, I would probably have to look into it a little more, because we haven't really tried to get a really detailed scan of those grains and try and relate it back to the processes. But I suspect it would be difficult. So
you would hesitate applying morphology to the
only to a point. Yeah, I would hesitate, and I would hesitate to the point to say that, oh, this has been through this, and this process. I don't think there's a specific effect on the grain that necessarily represents any specific process.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a question from Mike McMorrin again. Please go ahead.
The guy with all the questions again. With all of your experience with the KID data set now, Dave, have you spent any time looking at field sample weight versus concentrate weight, and looked into to see if there's any correlation between the mapping products and, say, till provenance, to see if that can help confirm what it is, that some of the work that you guys have done in your time spent up in the Slave?
Yeah, I would say that we have not looked at it in that detail. It is something that's come up in several conversations, trying to figure out what else can we extract, looking at the concentration weights, looking at the original weights. But usually what it comes down to is, do we have a big enough data set that we're confident in that we can, that whatever we're seeing in that data set is truly happening. So you're definitely onto something with the concentrate weights. As far as a mechanism to help refine defining those dispersal patterns. But we haven't looked at it, no, at a scale like, oh, here, how we did the granulometry, where we sent those off and looked at the specific granulometry based on those different environments. We haven't done that with the available KID data set.
Yeah, no, just a curiosity more than anything. It'd be interesting to just to see if, there's been a lot of talk in the Slave in particular, in Lac de Gras, about multiple till units, and it'd be interesting to see if you could pick some of that up perhaps in some of the concentrate versus field sample weights. Just be an interesting thing to look into.
Yeah, the discussion about multiple till units is an interesting one because it really depends on how you define what a till unit is. So is it just a till of a different provenance? There are people who believe that the only important transport is the most recent one, so there may be a 180-degree switch in ice flow, but it's only the last one that really matters, and in some situations that's absolutely true. You know, the question of till provenance, you start looking the northern side of Lac de Gras, and we get into very different till facies. So some are meltout tills that are subglacial in nature, but they're not being smeared on by flowing ice. They're being dropped down by stagnant ice. Still subglacial, general same concept applies, but it's a different mechanism. Now, is that a different till unit? And what are the implications on indicator minerals and on, you know, following up a dispersal, or what they look like? And what we've seen so far is that those meltout tills have strikingly lower Kim counts. Now, does that mean that there are no diamonds there? Does that mean there are no kimberlite there? There is no kimberlite there? Or is that just a function of that meltout till versus the lodgement till that we're typically seeing in other places? I suspect the latter, but we're really only just starting to get into that and looking at the difference in those data sets, because it's a large scale thing, so properties generally don't straddle the two different areas, but there happens to be one that does, that, you know, is complicated.
Yeah. Do you know if the fellows from out east, the Sam Kellys and the the other name escapes me.
Martin Ross.
Yes. Do you know if they are still conducting any work on till and 3 dimensions and?
Yeah, unfortunately, we lost Sam to the other side of the pond. He's somewhere in the UK doing work now, but I think he is still peripherally involved. And I suspect Martin is still doing his thing. I'm sure if there was a Yellowknife forum, he would have some students up there. He seems to be pretty active, and hopefully he keeps looking into that research. The looking at the 3D dispersal models is kind of what brings you back to, you do need to consider all of the ice flow history depending on where your sample was. If they're all surface samples, maybe there's some erosion. It's technically a surface sample, but you're actually looking at a very deep section of the till. We have done a lot of work in other places looking at the 3D distribution, but in the Slave, aside from those hummocky meltout tills that I spoke about earlier, most of it's pretty thin. So the application of looking, you know, using a drill to collect those samples is really going to be fairly property specific. When we get up into the meltout tills, I would love to see Martin have a student up there drilling through those and collecting a series of samples. Some of those are 30, 40 meters thick, and collecting samples throughout and see how exactly where the line between the lodgement and the meltout and what the difference in resulting indicators is.
Yeah, it was really interesting, the work that they'd done over the years with Barrett and the group there at the NWTGS. It'd be neat to see, you know, that data set and that process kind of taken to the next level. It was really interesting to see, and I know Buddy touched on it, just the dispersal pattern off of DO18 and 27 there. So that was interesting. It'd be neat to drag a couple students up there and.
Yeah, you could really dig into that, and you know, we've got one student now working with Brent, and I'm going to keep trying to feed him students to answer these specific problems, because it's really, you know, it's not necessarily industry who's going to push this research. We've got to get the academics interested in it again. We've got to have guys like Barrett, you know, who can pull in external funding to fund those academic projects to really, you know, answer some of those questions. I'm pretty sure the reason a lot of the northern area has had limited success finding kimberlite is just related to that till facies, and that we don't really understand what's going on at the subsurface versus the surface.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave.
So we are constrained by time. We have another 10 minutes. but I see a hand raised by Buddy Doyle again. Last question from Buddy, I hope.
All right, Buddy, I'll pull up the dispersal map.
No, don't have to do that. Forgive me. Yeah, no, just on the comments about, yeah, I mean, we had aerial photographs. You got much better days now, but I spent hundreds of thousands on till interpretation. I don't think I ever put them in the assessment reports, but it wasn't if we weren't doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Till anomalies don't give you drill targets. It basically says somewhere within this 1 square kilometer or 4 square kilometers, or maybe even further, there's a kimberlite. And one of the reasons the industry went off them is they're not instant gratification, which the industry
absolutely
seems to want. But there are dozens of indicated anomalies in the KID database that don't match kimberlites, and they might be glacial fluvial, they may not be. And, you know, we're just not, no one's looking. There's no, you can't get money for it because, you know, you get a 6-week season to sample them, and then you wait 8 weeks at a lab, and then you have to go and sample them again based on those results. And no one waits 2 years. Anyway, the second till, there's so many different names for tills, but the non-basal till that you were talking about around
meltwater till, yeah.
Yeah, we just saw that in the ICP. It was just, it has a big, suddenly you see a lot of calcium, which,
yeah.
So it's got distal limestones in it from God knows where,
yeah.
The Arctic islands. And so it's distal, you know, it's got a distal component. And yeah, the only way we found kimberlites underneath that was geophysics, that the indicators didn't work.
Yeah, I think you would, you know, there's going to be a mixed signal. It's going to be a subtle one. So we've seen similar situations in, you know, not necessarily in Slave. We've seen it in BC. We've seen it in other areas where you tend to get more stratigraphy. You can tease out those anomalies, and you usually have to look at a more focused multivariate approach to your geochemistry. The indicator minerals tend to fall off, like you're saying. Really, the best thing to do is probably drill. Get an RC rig in there, or get something in there that you can get your hands on the material, get an estimation of what it is. Don't assume it's all the same thing. Have someone look at it who can actually differentiate the two till units. And when you get that 3D picture, you're going to get down into that subglacial zone, or that lodgement till zone, which is where the more local material is. So, I mean, just in the stratigraphy of the ice, you've got a very sediment-rich layer at the bottom, and the lower stuff is the lodgement till, represents what's going to be the lodgement till and is local, and the higher stuff is what represents the meltout till, which is going to be distal, which is exactly what you've said. And another really good point that you've touched on is a dispersal and till does not move stock prices. It does not get anybody interested in putting money in it. They want to see drills in the ground, which forces the hand of exploration to put drills in the ground, maybe when they're not ready to yet. And again, like you said, till targets are the beginning. Like there's more work to do. Once you've refined that zone, there's more work to do once you're there. So, you know, it's a little bit longer term of a goal than some investors want to see, but hopefully, you know, we can do a little better and turn the tables a little bit.
Thanks, Dave.
All right, thank you. I don't see any more hands, and we are limited by time. So that puts an end to our event today. Please unmute yourselves, and let's give a round of applause to David.